Hi, everybody. Your support means the world to us. Our podcast is really focused on creativity, on care, on stories of inspiration, and inspiring characters of all kinds. It's such a wonderful, wonderful way to reach community. This is a labor of love. So, the real way we can sustain ourselves is through all of your support. Please rate, ideally 5 stars. Please share this with anyone and everyone you know, and feel free to reach out to us also with suggestions on guests. Reach us at podcastutopias@gmail.com. Thank you, everybody, for your support. All right, everybody. Our next episode of Utopias, this is an exciting one, is with Nipun Mehta. I met Nipun over 10 years ago, actually, at an incredible event, actually, called Karma Kitchen, where people just give whatever they want donation-wise, and they get fed. It's a kitchen based in Berkeley. And I got very intrigued by him when I met him. And then we crossed paths again just several months ago in Dubai, actually. And I was actually completely blown away by Nipun's talk at that conference. And that actually inspired some conversations we had at the conference and our conversation for this episode of Utopias in March of 2024. Nipun thinks about large scale social movements that are rooted in small acts of service. Like you can do just a little thing, like a little act of love, a little act of service here and there, and actually that can generate massive effects, massive implications. And I think that's really important at a time when people feel like challenges and problems are just out of reach and out of our grasp. Nipun is the founder of ServiceSpace, which is a global community working at the intersection of technology, volunteerism, and the gift culture. He was honored as an unsung, and that's really important to Nipun, being unsung hero of compassion by the Dalai Lama, and was on a council appointed by former US President Barack Obama, a council focused on poverty and inequality in the United States. So we talked deeply about mindfulness and meditation, but also the importance of compassion and how critical and important it is to generate a sense of awareness and to generate a sense of care for others at a time when so many feel isolated or fragmented or atomized. And we also talk a lot about social movements and interconnectedness. There's a lot of light in Nipun. There's tons of care. There's tons of creativity. And believe it or not, just listening to this conversation and getting into some of the inspirations Nipun brings our way gives us all a sense of things we can do to repair and care. So everybody, please enjoy this conversation recorded originally in March of 2024. Happy to welcome Nipun Mehta to Utopias. All right, everybody, I'm so happy to welcome my friend and colleague, servant of causes of care, causes of compassion, Nipun Mehta to Utopias today. Nipun, welcome to Utopias. I can't think of a better person to bring on at this time in discussions of care and repair and how we can build and think about systems that support us all around the planet. You are the perfect person for me to learn from today.
I'm happy to be here, and I'm equally excited to learn from what emerges in the space between you and I, Ramesh. Thank you for all the work that you stand for as well.
I appreciate you. So, let's start with being described as an unsung hero of compassion by the Dalai Lama. Tell me a little bit about how that came to be, how you met the Dalai Lama or have interacted with him or his people, and also about the importance of the connection between compassion and being an unsung hero. So how do we think through this?
Yeah. Well, in some sense, well, I don't know how much of an unsung hero I am and how much of an expert I am on compassion either, but at some level, maybe they're connected because if you're unsung, you have less of a formed identity around who you are, what you do, what you stand for. And having less of an identity can potentially drop you into a larger field of emergence, which is compassion, which can be compassion. And so maybe there's a definite connection there. But yeah, you look at people like Dalai Lama. I used to be on his foundation's board many years ago. But what was interesting was for a lot of people, it's a photo op. You go in, it's kind of a cool thing. You feel blessed as well in that moment. But I would say for me, before I even met him, I was very close friends with his longtime secretary, and one of my friends, he wrote to me one time, and he says, I have this student going through a tough time. And I think it would mean the world to him if he were to meet the Dalai Lama. And that was actually Adam Grant. He's a professor at Wharton. And when Adam sent me that note, I was like, I have yet to angle my way in to meet the Dalai Lama. I could, but I've never done it myself. Now, do I do it for like this stranger? And this was like, I don't know, 15, 17 years ago. And Adam himself was like now he's quite popular, but at that time, he'd just written a book, Give and Take, and yeah, he got to this guy actually. His one of his students went to meet the Dalai Lama, and I think it changed the course of his life. But I think along the way, I realized that it's not so much about meeting those people, but really embodying the values. And as you embody the values and you decenter yourself that yeah, I could be there and I could feel blessed. I could, have a photo that's also a reminder for me that, this is my higher self, things like that. But I could also give that to somebody else. And in the process of giving that opportunity to somebody else before I've even had it, you're trusting a larger field of relationships. And so, in that small way, I felt like I had my deeper connection with Dalai Lama's field of unsungness and compassionate. And so, yeah, years later, I did end up receiving this award, and it was quite beautiful. And he is, of course, who he is larger than life in so many ways and yet so natural and so humble. Maybe I'll just tell you one quick anecdote of his that I liked. With this, one of my friends was invited to Dharamsala for a dialogue with. I mean, I think there were like 40 scientists, neuroscientists. They were really talking about some of this. And at some point, I think the dialogue was on compassion. And at some point, somebody asked him a question about how long does it take to figure out if somebody is compassionate? Can we just can we study their brain and just figure out what is their potential for, the prefrontal cortex to get ignited in this way, that way, all this stuff, right? They would have asked. And Dalai Lama looks and he says, "Oh, I think it takes a very long time." And everyone's like, "Very long time. Okay, how long?" And he's like, "Oh, I think like 30, 40 years." Like 30, 40 years. I mean, here's a person, presumably, one of his real remarkable strengths is compassion. And he is saying, man, even if you know the physiology underneath it, it would take you a long time because your mind states are arising and passing. And to see what the core center of gravity is, you might have a moment of compassion, but to say that your core center of gravity will return, like that is its normal state and that is compassion. That would take a long time. But that's not really the anecdote. The thing is, what happened is every day Dalai Lama was like coming in last and they were all lined up on the side. As the Dalai Lama comes in, everyone bows just out of respect. And then the Dalai Lama bows back. And with this, and so every day people are bowing, and my friend noticed the first day, well, Dalai Lama bowed, okay. Second day, Dalai Lama bowed, but he bowed to a very different height. And but it seemed so precise. So 3 days, 4 days, and he kind of was like, what's going on? What is Dalai Lama's algorithm? Because it wasn't just like, a mindless bow. It was like a very specific bow, and it was at very specific different heights every day. And he's like, what is he doing? And he realized that the Dalai Lama would receive everyone's bows, would see who is bowing the lowest, and made sure to bow lower than that. And I was like, wow, like that is a deep kind of humility to receive something as subtle as a bow from a group of people and to yet see the through line to the infinite and who you are. So yeah. Well, thanks for reminding me of that. I haven't reflected on that in a long time.
Well, it also speaks to how one can be aware, be present in the moment. That's ultimately what meditation is, or right, is connecting to those fleeting moments where you feel the compassion in your body mind, and how the Dalai Lama bowing, even more deeply than anybody who had bowed to him was an indication not only of his desire to show his own humility, that his own self is actually just part of the community, the Sangha, but also that he was aware of how everyone else was bowing to him.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So Nipun, I was blown away when we last met last November, and you told me, and I knew I had known this before, that you and your partner, your wife, you're from California. I think you have an engineering background. You mentioned to me before, and then at some point, you and your wife like sort of gave it all up and gave up all your material possessions and moved to India and just kind of traveled by foot. Can you tell us this story? What was behind it, and how did this come from your own history and your own past? And like, please share this story with us because I think it's sort of a Gandhian story. Well, I want to talk about Gandhi in a moment, but please, yeah.
Yeah. That's great. Yeah, it was such a joy, first of all, to meet you as well, Ramesh, there. And to see you share and to see the warmth that when you weren't on stage, with which you carried yourself with everyone. I really appreciated that. And yeah, I don't remember specifically telling you that, but this is a true story. I'm sure we shared it in passing, and my wife and I indeed decided at some point, we had started ServiceSpace like long back. It was particularly my calling back in 1999, but at some point it became quite popular. It was quite influential. We weren't working with money, but we had a lot of social capital, and for us, the pursuit was to do all this for our own inner transformation, to ultimately get to the fullness of emptiness, and not the fullness of ego. That's very significantly different. And we said that, wow, you can actually become full of your ego even when you're doing the work of community, even when you're not working directly with money. And how can you make sure that all of this, the work that we were doing, how it was scaling, how it was doing wonderful things in the world, how we had so much, yeah, yeah, some level of impact. Now, I don't know what so much or so little means, but it was more than just me being myself and being an engineer. Um, so we said, how do you know? And I says, my wife said, there's only one way to find out. Can you let it go? If you can't let it go, you're had. And if you're ahead, what good is all this? That, yeah, maybe there's some external impact, but you haven't changed. It's not just about what you do, it's about who you're becoming. And so from that space, she would like put this question forth. And I'm sort of an, intellectual kind of guy. I would have convinced myself that, yeah, yeah, no, man, I'm a good guy. I know good people. We talk about good things. We stand for good things. Look at the work that we do. But I was like, well, your mind is very hijackable, So it's like, how do you know? How do you know you aren't hijacked by the subconscious voices of your ego? And I was like, yeah, like, can we let it go? And so we actually did sell everything we had. We put a few of our boxes of valuables in my parents' house in Santa Clara, where you also grew up nearby there. Um, and we went to the Gandhi ashram in India because Gandhi was someone who inspired both of us. And we said, we went on a walking pilgrimage. We said we would eat whatever food is offered and sleep wherever place is offered. For toiletries, we had $1 between the two of us, so like practically nothing. And we were really in the hands of the universe. And it taught us so much. To say changed us would be an understatement. I mean, you're literally, it's one thing to believe in kindness. I always stood for kindness. I always tried to be kind. But can you be kind when it's 110 degrees, when you don't know where your water is going to come from, you don't know where your food's going to come from, you don't know where you're going to sleep, and all these insecurities are coming up in front of you. And then there's that one vegetable vendor who's like pushing his cart. Like, can you generate enough compassion? Can you decenter yourself enough to include the vegetable vendor? So you look at him and you say, this is also me. And if I can, if I'm able, I would like to push his cart. If there is a grandpa holding his haystack on his head, like if I can, I would like to hold his haystack. And but before physically, even if I could, like internally, I have to get out of all my insecurities and all my dramas and all my incessant thinking that's like unending to just kind of land in the moment, arrive, and generate an intention of kindness and care. And if I can do that, then I can have relationships. And if I can have relationships, then out of 10, at least one person's going to be like, hey, where are you staying tonight? Hey, where are you eating tonight? Hey, I'm selling ice cream in my little cart. Can I give you one? Or believe it or not, somebody actually would even give me haircuts because he's like, I've got a haircutting salon here. And it's not a salon, it doesn't even have electricity. This is in the villages, but I don't know what other word to use for it, but like, I could cut your hair, and it sounds very funny because I have very little hair now, but yeah, it changed us. And I think it showed us at a design level too, right? As we think about designing societies and designing our lives even, you say, what is the organizing principle under that? And if the organizing principle is transactional, you only get so far, I think. And you have a lot of fear that comes up when you are not transactional and you don't secure your own, even food and shelter through the means of those transactions. You are rooted in kindness. Through kindness comes an act of service, a small act, an immeasurable act. But through that service, you change and you build a relationship. And that web of relationships is actually your security, not what you are accumulating, but what you are circulating. And that, is a fundamentally different design principle. Intellectually, I knew it, but being in the hands of the universe like that with somebody that that you really care about, I mean, that's a different experience altogether. And I saw, if you were to say, well, what did you learn? I would say, I would say that kindness is powerful, and that you don't need to wait, many tough days, many people acting in very misaligned ways towards us even. And when we face that, initially I might have thought, like, okay, why can't the world be a little kinder? It's like, man, it would be nice if the world was a little kinder. But I think by the end of the pilgrimage, I think the question I started asking myself is, well, I don't know about the world, but I know I can be a little bit kinder. So how can I be kinder for the world instead of expecting the world to be kind for me? And as I do that, it creates a ripple effect, right? And so you trust in that ripple effect. So that sounds simple. I mean, it takes 10 seconds to say it, but to live it in the depths of your subconscious. I mean, I think I'm still trying, but it's a remarkable journey.
So for everybody that's listening you know, that feels like isolated, that feels alone, so many people feel alone and isolated. So many people are going to opiates to kind of numb their pain from, the OxyContin crisis to now fentanyl. What would be a piece of advice you would share to people who are listening to this or viewing this that are suffering? We know we all suffer, right? But it's like, what's a way in which one can overcome that loneliness and that feeling of isolation of feeling all alone?
Yeah,
Just
it
that.
is it is a pretty serious issue. Didn't Vivek Murthy say it's like loneliness is kind of an epidemic? Something like an equivalent of 15 cigarettes a day is what we're doing to our physiology.
This is the
Um,
Surgeon General. That's right. He said it's an epidemic, Vivek Murthy.
yeah. And I think we do see that. And it's tough. I really like John Pendergast's framework around it. He says, the way I simplify it, he talks about groundedness, but I think of it as asking yourself, where am I? And if you say, well, where am I? And you can't find yourself, if we're so traumatized, then the way to find yourself, where am I? Like, I'm here, I'm here. Sometimes you're so traumatized, you can't even find yourself. Then he says the second stage of that is that you say, I'm my body. Where am I? I'm in my body. Third stage of that is that my body is in me, that I'm something a little bit bigger. It's like an ocean in which this wave of a body is arising and passing. And then the fourth sort of stage is that everything is my body. And so what's interesting about that, and he doesn't go into this, but the way I tend to think is that if I can't find myself, and I think the path for me is to go, and this is not like progressive things. This is wherever you are. Like sometimes you may end up with like having this peak experience of everything is my body, and then all of a sudden you find yourself lonely, depressed, traumatized. You can't even find yourself. But if I were to find what advice would I give myself, right? Like, so if I found myself in a state where I can't find where I'm at, I would want to go in a place and say, oh, I'm here, I'm in my body. And I think that hop is facilitated by reconnecting with the me part of myself. And a lot of this is the work of self-compassion. If I feel like I'm starting off in a place where am I? Well, I'm here, I'm in my body. The growing edge for us is to go from there to the next hop, which is that actually my body is in me. And that expansion happens by actually moving from me to we. And I think this happens through small acts of service. So we always have our acts of service accessible to us. And I think it's each act of service we tend to think is, we look at the external effect, external ripple effect and external impact. But actually, before that external impact manifests itself, there's an inner ripple effect. There's a change within us. And there's a lot of science behind how every act of kindness creates like this release of dopamine and serotonin and oxytocin and all these endorphins in the body, right? So if I'm trying to move from I'm in my body to my body is in me, for that stage, an act of service is a profoundly expansive practice. Um, and then in the third stage, where if you find yourself that, wow, I am the ocean in which the waves are rising and passing, service comes really naturally to me, not just naturally, right? It's actually regenerative endlessly. Like this is not just out of empathy. Empathy doesn't quite get you there. Empathy is where you will have this empathy fatigue after a while. That if I see a person who's burning, I might, my brain feels like my brain is burning, and so I respond externally to help the person, but partly it's just to alleviate myself of that feeling. And that empathy is not regenerative. But if you find that deeper compassion beyond empathy, that then allows you to, I think, regenerate. And if you find yourself in that state, right? Like if you're like, wow, I could do this forever, man. I could keep loving the world forever, in these small ways. I don't need any recognition. I don't need any impact measurement. No, no KPIs, man. I'm just doing it and I'm smiling. You're smiling. That's been enough. But then I think that stage of not just that I'm the ocean in which this wave is doing its dance, from there, I think there's a deeper stage as well, which is the field of not just me, not just we, but from we to us. And that us is where you start saying, everywhere is my body, right? Everything is my body. And that us is a bit more like, if we look in nature, we see examples of this, like these amazing murmurations of starlings that are, each starling is only aware of the seven starlings around them. And yet they are in these incredible formations that are just brilliant. They have no HR department, they have no central, person guiding them, and yet they're tuned in uh, because they preserve their uniqueness, but they are led by their universality first. If we lead with our uniqueness first, we never quite get to deep universality. And we see this in nature all the time, and that's the us. So it's not just the we, because we sometimes can also be very insular, right? We, the bald people, yeah, and hence, we are, you create an other, right? You create an in circle and an out circle. And so, to me, that question of like, what would I do if I was feeling lonely? I would see where I am. And based on where I am, I would say, okay, well, I need to be kind to myself. I need to be kind to other people. And I need to start to release my identity and step into the field of us. And I think all three of those are really good practices.
It's so powerfully said. So for people who are thinking about what are some ways I can engage in service, seva, as we say, from Sanskrit and Pali, right? Um, to just sort of start that process of experiencing the we, realizing that yourself is not just narrow or shallow or flattened, but it's actually relational. You've used the word webs of relations a couple of times. I think that's really powerful. The Starling example is one of webs of relations, right? And I want to ask you about this in relation to the organization you started, ServiceSpace. So you have been trying, you've figured out ways to try to support folks who want to engage in small acts of service so they can move from I to we and we to us. And you say, with service space, you have three constraints: no staff, no fundraising, and no impact assessments, which is the exact opposite of how many social enterprises function and NGOs, non-governmental organizations, function. So tell us what's going on there. Like, tell us about ServiceSpace and what are some acts of service that people who are listening to can just try out, small little things so they can actually experience the me to we.
Yeah, well, we started this little game long time back with I was in the basement of my cousin's house in Chicago one time, and he's a really hip, cool guy, and and we started somehow talking about pranks, and he's like, and I said, people spend a lot of time doing these pranks, and I was like, what is it? But they're mostly destructive, right? And it's like, what is it that drives them? And so we were like, oh, there's so much creativity, there's so much courage, there's so much, this enthusiasm. And we broke it all down and we're like, okay, well, instead of destructive ways in which we do this, can we do this in constructive ways, And so we created a little game right then that we called it a smile card. So you do something kind for somebody and you leave a smile card behind. And the smile card says, tag your it. You don't know who did this to you. It's an anonymous act of kindness, but go out. You can't pay back, but go out and pay it forward. Keep the chain going, So it was like, it was like this play on things. And so we did all kinds of things, right? Like, can you imagine paying toll for the car behind you? Or let's say you are the receiving end. You're in the front and you pay for my toll. And as you do, like the person, telling me this would be like, I don't know, but the car in front of you, I didn't even know that his name was Ramesh, but like he just kind of hooked it up. And your toll's been paid for. Like you can imagine how happy I would feel, how happy the toll attendant would feel, how happy you might feel looking in the rearview mirror if you do, although it's kind of like unknown. You may never have this person's phone number. And then me going home and sitting with my family on the dining table, I'll be like, guess what happened today? And the world is not a scary place. Like there are good people. It gives you a different kind of hope. You feel like you belong, and you feel like kindness belongs. You feel like compassion belongs. And so if you once you understand this, you're like, man, every moment, right? Like I was at Harvard recently, a couple months ago. In fact, right before we met, and I was speaking at their medical school, and they had this gala event at the end, and all these fancy, it was like a nice dinner. People were dressed really nice, and one of the waiters comes and he's bringing he's bringing the hors d'oeuvres, and I said, and I've been vegetarian my whole life, and so he says, I said, hey, is this vegetarian? And he's like, oh, I think it is. It has this, and this, and I don't think this is though. You should try this. And so he's like giving me this. And he just was very engaged and he knew the ingredients, all of this. He gives it to me and he waits for me and he's looking and he's like, so how was it? And like he wants a review, right? Like he wants a Yelp review right then and there. And I'm like, yeah, man, this is really good. You should try it. He says, yeah, maybe I will. I said, why don't you have one right now? He's like, oh no, I'm not allowed to do that. And he just described it in such detail, and he was really looking forward to my feedback. I felt like he should really have it. And he's like, I'm not allowed to have it. And then so I took one piece, I took a separate piece, and I said, but I'm allowed to do this. And I just put it in his mouth. And you can imagine, like, he then brought everything my way, right? That's one thing. But you can imagine the relationship between him and I. And we didn't exchange. He's not he doesn't follow me on Twitter. I'm not even on Twitter, but he's like, we don't have each other's. In fact, I did ask him his name, but I don't even remember his name. He wouldn't remember my name, but man, did I feel like I belonged. And so what I would say is, to test out this theory of change, that in letting go of my self-interest, even for a moment, and using that ignition, internal ignition, to translate it to an act of kindness. Like, what actually happens? Am I less than or am I greater than what I was having done that? And if you just do that objectively, like just do it one act a month, right? You don't need to quit your job and you don't need the world to change and you don't need, the elections to go a certain way. You're just like, I'm good. Like, you try it out. I think it changes you. And so I would say, and so ServiceSpace at some level stems from this deep insight that the smallest act of kindness has intrinsic value, even if its impact is distributed over time and space, that nobody can measure it. And that is valuable, that is meaningful, that changes the arc of the world in the gentlest way, but perhaps the strongest way. And hence we have this thing of no impact assessments, as you were saying, like, forget about it, dude. It's like if somebody says, what's been the impact of ServiceSpace? I'm like, before we can get into that, dude, let's just hug, let's go out, do an act of kindness, and let's see what emerges. And then, of course, there's a question of like, if you have an ecosystem where people are committed, where this is a shared agreement, where this is sort of how we're all convening, it's an organizing principle, what emerges? Initially, we discount it because of so much cultural conditioning, and we say, this is a lemonade stand. What's the big deal, dude? My kids can do it, Like, what did you go to Berkeley for? To do a lemonade stand? I've grown up with this kind of stuff, right? Like, so it's fine, it's fine. Yeah, I did. But, let's forget about that track. Let's see how happy you are. Let's see how happy I am. Let's see what emerges in the space in between us. And if you keep at it, right, this thing will, like, this movement of love, which sounds so, it can sound so cliche, but it's incredibly powerful. Gandhi called it the law of love. And he said something profound. He said, when they asked him, where do you go to learn the law of love? Now, this was a man that the highest saints of the time in India, from Raman Maharishi to Yogananda, were writing poems about Gandhi. And he says that to learn the law of love, I would go to little children. So it's not some esoteric practice that you achieve after like 18 years of meditation up in the Himalayas. It's something we're endowed with. I mean, it's already there. We sort of beat it out of our system, but it's there. And if we can reconnect with that, not only are we happy and the people around us are happy, but the relationships that emerge as a result of that. And then collectively, the field of intelligence in that kind of a relational space would be very powerful. And that's what we're seeing with ServiceSpace is that, okay, you could have said for the first 5, 10 years, you'd be like, yeah, they're building websites for nonprofits. They don't want to brand themselves. They're just giving, it's like, call me when you grow up, many people would tell me that. Like I was like, okay, I will. Yeah.
Sure. So,
But
I
now it's a
know
different story.
totally. And I know, like, when we first met, which was over a decade ago, you had a initiative called the Karma Kitchen in Berkeley. I remember that very fondly. I'm a subscriber to a newsletter that you send out called Karuna News, which is different than Corona News, but it was coming out very similar. Karuna is means compassion in both, I think in both Sanskrit and Pali. And so maybe just to give people a little bit like details, in a more applied way, what does service space do? Or I know it's not about you per se, but it's
Yeah.
like what do you all
Yeah.
facilitate and how can people get involved, not just with service space, but more generally with acts of service
Yeah.
or even to subscribe to Karuna News, etc.
Yeah, yeah, no. Well, initially we started with a service long, long back in late 90s, even pre-service space. It was called Daily Good. But our fundamentally our thought was, well, we want to serve. Well, how should we practice our service? So we started by building websites for nonprofits back in 1999. And then we said, well, websites were great, but our function isn't just to become like website deliverers, right? Like, and good thing we didn't do that because AI is going to pretty soon do all of that for us. But we said, that our thing is to have a community of givers. Like I think Mr. Rogers said, whenever you're feeling you're in trouble, and we're all going to be in trouble, our resilience is going to be tested many times through life. He says, look for the helpers. And so if you had a community of helpers, if you have yourself been a helper, and there are some structures that facilitate that, it's right there. It gives you resilience. You could take a vow to be like service hearted and to do 18 acts of kindness every month. But if you do it in community, you will be a lot more regenerative. It'll last a lot longer. So based on that principle, like we said, wow, we were building websites for nonprofits. Then we said, we have all this institutional capacity. What should we do? We started doing vertical portals, right? So we started, Daily Good that I spoke about, or KarmaTube, or we created one of the biggest websites on the web on kindness. And these were all things that were non-monetizable. And so nobody was really doing it in a substantial way, but we had figured out how to create an ecosystem of volunteers to actually concretely and sustainably deliver these values to the world. And so that was sort of the second phase. And then we started thinking, like, can we do more stuff offline? And so the example you gave, Karma Kitchen. Uh, so we were like, what happens if you go in a space and you have a certain principle that after every meal, like your meal, the check at the end of your meal will read zero. It's a regular restaurant, but your check will read zero, not because it's free, but because someone before you has paid for you, and you are trusted to pay forward whatever you want for people after you, right? Will you stay in your me and say, look, yeah, life's been tough. I don't really want to give. Will you step into the we? Will you step into the us? Will you step into a field of gratitude and be like, look, man, I can only afford $3, but I'm going to give five because I stand for what this is, and I am experiencing it right now. And so we have profound series of different stories and anecdotes and like totally heart-opening experiences, and we saw that. We ran it for 7 years in Berkeley. At one point it was the highest rated restaurant in on Yelp, and it's volunteer run. Like you couldn't get a seat, it was everybody, and it was amazing. And then people all over the world started doing it. Most recently in Vienna this summer. This restaurant owner was really blown away by it. And he says, I'm going to do it every single day. In Berkeley, we just ran it once a week as kind of a pop-up. But this guy he says, I'm going to do it he says, Vienna was just voted the grumpiest city in the world, and I'm going to make it the friendliest. And so for 3 months of this summer, and I think it's been, I don't know, something like 38 places around the world where people have used that example to seed a sort of gift culture, a gift economy, a connection between the me and the we and the us. And so that became its own sort of thing. The pandemic came, and one of the things that emerged in the pandemic, we were like all stuck offline. So now it's like we had all these, millions of people coming to our websites online. We had all these offline things happening, not just Karma Kitchen, in addition, so many other things as well. And then the pandemic kind of crashes everything. So I think in the first in the very first month we launched Karuna News that you spoke about. It was people responding to suffering with compassion, that it didn't just need to be fear, and so that was incredible. We were doing these Zoom calls, and everybody was attracting a lot of people. But then we were like, well, it's just a Zoom call, like how do we go a little deeper into building a relational web, which we were doing offline. We would do these retreats and all kinds of stuff. And so we kind of knew what was happening offline. We said, how do we bring it into an online peer learning platform? And so we created something called Pods. And that has been an incredible, I don't think there's any peer learning platform online that is optimized for the kinds of things we optimize it for volunteerism, for service, for the kind of sense of belonging that emerges from that is just absolutely very unique. And then most recently, last year, we were like, AI, we got to do something about AI. And you look at this and you're like, what? Like these volunteers, man, how in the world are they so agile and nimble? And so we said that, okay, well, the whole world is going in the direction of large language models, but we think there's a lot of blind spots there. And so we said, how do we do small language models? And not just small language models, how do we create data commons where everyone can create a polyculture field of wisdom, which is to say, that I could create my own kind of bot, and I can say, well, I want the Ramesh data set, and I want the Gandhi data set, and I want the Fukuoka farming data set, and build something that actually is aspirational for me. So we've been working on that, and have had a fair amount of traction. So yeah, so ServiceSpace is doing a whole lot of things in the field of hand and head and heart. I would say the combination of all three of those.
I mean, there's so many interesting projects that you mentioned, and we'll link to some of these projects in the podcast description, so all of our listeners and viewers can become familiar with it. Even the idea of, and I'm going to get to talking with you about technology and where we are with that in after this next question, but even in terms of thinking about AI systems, hey, all of us get to have an opportunity to engage with an AI, a generative AI, like a chatbot system, but we get to decide what that AI system represents and what it doesn't. I mean, that is so, so, so important at this time. So, I mean, I can't wait to learn more about all these and in whatever ways I can support all the great things you all are up to, Nipun. Um, so, I want to ask you about, it doesn't, we don't have to look far around us. I'm in Los Angeles, you're in the Bay Area, where we see sort of this like mindfulness thing taking root all around us, right? So some people, a little bit cynically or sarcastically describe wellness and mindfulness as some sort of industrial complex, right? It's like, I know people who pray and not just pray, but sort of practice meditation so they can get rich or so they can get powerful or like,
Yeah.
and sort of in a sense, I'm not trying to say this with judgment, perhaps engage in these practices to support themselves, perhaps in a somewhat narrow sense. So I want to ask you about that because, we know there are the folks like the Deepak Chopras of the world, or I forgot the name of the gentleman, Jay Shetty, folks like that who've built empires. I'm not even saying it's inherently bad, but they built empires out of, kind of being spokespeople and almost speaking about mindfulness and wellness in a kind of contemporary capitalist and corporate context. Um, So I want to ask you about that direction that, meditative and spiritual practices, even wellness practices have taken relative to where you all are heading with service space. And of course, like you said, it's not just you all, there are many service spaces around the planet.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think what you're talking about is this McMindfulness phenomena, right? Like that you just kind of have this cookie cutter approach. I mean, mindfulness has helped a lot of people. I think it's incredible that it's gone so mainstream. But underneath it, there's a very famous quote by an African American feminist, Audre Lorde, says the master's house can,
I love Audre Lorde.
yeah,
I love that you said that.
the master's house cannot be dismantled by the master's tools. Um, and so you look and you say, well, I have all this stress. I need to de-stress. Mindfulness can help me. Okay, that seems like a reasonable logic, right? Like even if you don't even call it mindfulness, right? Like what, say, Huberman at Stanford call it, breath work. Fantastic. Like, okay, at some point you start to go upstream and you say, well, why am I stressed? Like, can I actually look at the causes of that stress? And if your solution is actually propagating those same causes, then it's like it's not really the most optimal solution. And so I think that's the challenge that we get into is that a lot of well-meaning people, a lot of people with genuine insight come into the world. They want to share, they want to give their gifts, but it's boxed into a very narrow frame. And so like one of my friends, very close friend, helped Facebook go from one like button to a range of emotions. And they gave him, this is Decker Keltner at UC Berkeley, one of the world's leading researchers of compassion. And they gave him sort of like a blank check. And he went into it thinking, oh, this is fabulous, that I will be able to have billions of people not just like expand their emotion range, but if there is an extractive element that's a larger wrapper around it, how effective is your intervention going to be? And so to me, I tend to look and say, to me, the most revolutionary projects, no matter how small, no matter how subtle, no matter how immeasurable they are, if you are doing something outside of the structures of money, power, and fame. I mean, I think of it as the three M's, right? Like the markets, media, and the military. If you're able to do anything outside of that, that is aligned with your deepest sort of experience of life, of love, of kindness, of compassion. To me, that's incredibly powerful. And we have to resist this temptation to create short-term success, short-term scale. And these are definitions, right? Like it's just by our cultural definition of success that, oh my God, like if I have 1 million followers on Insta, like Ramesh is going to think that I am influential. But like that's just a made up thing in my mind. Maybe Ramesh is going to think I'm a great guy if I'm like kind to my parents, like it's you don't we don't have to make up these things culturally, but we do. And I think the counter sort of the panacea to all of this, I think, is to do things outside the three M's, outside money, power, and fame. And you say, well, how can I do that? And I think you can. I think it's a failure of our imagination. So the way in which ServiceSpace frames it is you're like, wow, like without money, like what you said, Ramesh, like one of our principles is no fundraising. And so you're like, wow, you're just going to wait for gratitude for somebody to be moved to offer like for no reason at all. Like, who's going to do that? And you're like, well, what you end up becoming, if you have that principle, what you end up becoming good at is realizing that there are multiple forms of wealth, that we're just really bad at understanding like time capital or attention capital or story capital or technology capital or, cultural capital or community capital or creativity capital. So we just don't have containers to hook all of these outside of the three M's. And so we say, oh my God, if I don't have money, I have no capacity. And that's just not true. So we have to test that hypothesis. And similarly, like you look and you say, wow, like, if I could just broadcast it. So all these bad people in the world are broadcasting such bad messages. If I just had a bigger mic, I could do this. That's the same Audre Lorde trap, same trap that Audre Lorde is warning us about. Like, don't do that. And you're like, well, what else can I do? Like, I'll just be like whispering to the wind and no one will care. And you're like, yeah, you may want to test it out because if you do, you might realize that along with broadcast, there's this thing called deepcast that you actually go heart to heart to heart to heart. And then from that lens and that experience, you look back at people who have created sustainable change. You're like, man, they were tapped into a deep cast network. Like Gandhi didn't just say, I'm going to fast here. As soon as he says he's fasting, all of a sudden, millions of people across the country are like, I just didn't feel like eating dinner today. Like, this is history of India. And similarly with power, like we tend to think top-down command and control is the way to go, and that's what we think of as traditional leadership. But we can compost that and turn it into laddership. We think of it in ServiceSpace. We coined this word called laddership, where you're not leading from the front of the room saying, hey, here's my vision, and plan and execute. Let's get there. And the faster we get there, the better we are, right? Like that muscular kind of strength. Laddership is being in the back of the room, being aware of all the relationships, all the nodes in the room. And once you're aware of that, sort of like acupuncture, right? Like my wrist was hurting at one point, and I went into acupuncturist, and they were like, and it took me a couple of months. I'm like, what is this? I got an MRI thinking, okay, maybe it's a fracture or hairline fracture. I don't know what it was, but it was just like I'm holding something, and I would just go weak, and these guys are like, oh yeah, yeah, like they just put a needle in my neck. And I'm like, I don't have a problem in my neck. But they're like, oh, well, the neck is connected to your shoulder's connected to your arm's connected to and because they're aware of all of this, a small micro intervention, a gentle nudge created this incredible ripple effect. But that gentle nudge is not going to create a ripple effect unless you are aware of all the relationships in the room. And if you are looking, if you're in a top down, if you're on the stage, you don't have that capacity. Now, it doesn't mean it's just leadership or just laddership. It's like you have to learn to oscillate between leadership and laddership. You have to learn to oscillate between broadcast and deepcast. You have to learn to oscillate between financial wealth that is really aimed at accumulation and centralization to multiple forms of wealth, which is much more inclusive and gives everyone a chance to belong. And so to just have a portfolio of all of these things changes the game. And so to me, like not just mindfulness, even service, even all the work of impact that so many good people are doing, if you sit down, like honestly, heart to heart, sit under a tree with all these founders, as I have done, man, so many times, you're like, people will tell you, man, look, I've been doing this work. It's really hard. I feel like I can't stop, but I feel like I'm exhausted. I feel like I'm burnt out. I feel like I'm alone. And I don't really see a way out. And I think that's because of these tools that we've been using. Now, there's value to it, so I don't mean to undermine that. But at the same time, I think really the revolutionaries of our current time. This would have been different, 20 years ago. But I think anyone who is thinking outside the money power frame box, and that smallest act outside that box, I think, has the potential to be a profoundly revolutionary act. So we work outside of that. Yeah.
Yeah, I can see that. It's a lot of it is about feels to me like just trusting, try this out, trust this, just do something little. Just play with your own sort of boundaries and your own sort of anxieties that create these boundaries and understandable desires to feel secure, to feel seen. Just try to go outside that little membrane and just see what happens. See how it goes. and see how that creates something that was never part of a top-down model of scalable impact, fundraising, numbers of followers, these things, which are, again, not irrelevant,
Yeah.
but they're actually one language of expression and interaction that has come to take up all of our headspaces and even sort of channel mindfulness and service into that
Yeah.
sort of, model.
Yeah. And that becomes very transactional. And so I think we have to be
Yes.
mindful of that. Like it just strips out the relationships, right? Now, even if I'm running a nonprofit, if I have to show my funders all my impact, then all of a sudden, you or Phoebe come and I'm saying, well, what can you do for me so that this looks good and gives me institutional capacity? Kind of takes away from like me honoring you and the relationship with you, right? So
Yeah.
even volunteerism can be completely transactionalized. And when you do that, you just strip the heart out of it. And when you strip the heart out of it, it's not regenerative. So then you just have to go and do all this drama to try to get volunteers and say, wow, we look at our board members and maybe you'll get a photo op with them or look at,
Right.
look at the state of the world, right? You should do something and trying to guilt them into it. And that's just not sustainable.
It's sort of like you sort of, so many, like, without sort of being attached to the need for some external validation, just try this out, see how it feels without that being the primary frame, knowing that that also comes from a sense of competition. It's so much around us, and also from a sense perhaps of deficit, or that you can't really feel safe um, in these webs of relations. But you can just start small. You can just start by doing something with ServiceSpace or with Karma Kitchen, or I know Karma Kitchen was 12 years, but one of your many, many projects, and many others like find the others, right? So, I think it's really important that we talk about this in relation to where technology is heading. You knew that was going to come. And, um, and then I want to end by asking you about your utopias, your heroes, and a little bit about you, a little more about you personally, even if as you wish to share. So there's a couple of thoughts here. So, first of all, you have quoted the LinkedIn founder, Reid Hoffman, if I'm not mistaken,
Yeah.
um, who says social networks do best when they tap into one of the seven deadly sins. Again, I'm going to repeat that. Social networks do best when they tap into one of the deadly sins. So social media, really. Facebook is ego. Zynga is sloth. LinkedIn, which he created, is greed. And I want to ask you about that, about how the self is being represented through numbers, represented, right? It's like there is this self, there's lots of different selves. There's the self of kindness, of giving, but it's being represented through a series of numbers gathered by some third parties to create the wealthiest industries in the history of the world that are taking over everything imaginable, from taxi drivers to hotel workers, not supporting unionization. And some of their industries are based upon sort of a zombie model, which is like this data will eventually create new industries, which will create new industries, which will new industries. And a lot of valuation is built upon that. So that's one economy we're witnessing, right? One where the youngest people in the country are the first to make less than their parents, life expectancy is decreasing. But then we see this other economy that we can imagine, one where it's not just about commercial value, it's also about a creative economy. It's also about a care-driven economy, the three C's that Andrew Yang spoke with us about, actually. Similar to the ideas that Bauhaus had, actually, back in the day. So I'm asking you all this to discuss where we are with tech, social media, AI as well, and sort of a different vision of life, including economic life, that supports all these different attributes we have as human beings, including our capacity to give and care and love.
Yeah. I mean, it's a big question. It's if we think about technology, one of the things in the Silicon Valley that made its rounds, like one of these Twitter posts that I think went around, was technology is an amplifier of human intent. That sounds great, right? But I think I think it's like you can ask yourself, well, which human intent? There's so many different kinds of human intentions. And how are we going to give ourselves the exposure of the entire spectrum? Um, and so I think technology more accurately probably accelerates and automates the status quo. And if it is going to, automate the status quo, we have to say, well, the status quo is not so great. It doesn't work for a lot of people. And so how are we mindful that this is actually going to change the paradigm, and not just going to solidify the current inequities, the current sort of problems underneath the carpet? And I think with AI, it's a really it brings us to the sort of the peak of this question, because it's a really stark mirror to our faces, because it's going to be, it's going to start to automate the status quo in an incredible, at a very alarming pace. I mean, it took TV 75 years to get to 100 million users. And which meant that, like, growing up in many cultures, like I grew up in India, like when I was very young, and there was a TV quota, and like how did we come up with that in our family? And so we negotiated all of that socially and in all kinds of different ways. We called it the idiot box, and we called it all these things. But now you look and you say, well, how long does it take Netflix to get to 100 million users? Like 9 years. How long does it take ChatGPT? 2 months, 3 months. And so if you look at that adoption ramp, you say, well, where am I going to ask the hard questions? And how do I even process all of this? And so if we don't really ask these hard questions, I think we will just automate the status quo. And that will be very problematic for a whole lot of people. And so AI is a pretty incredible lever that is, I think, hurtling at us. I mean, I don't think there's any way to stop it at this point. But can we tweak the arc? So on one side, there's a lot of alarms, but there's also possibilities, right? Like you look and you say, well, there's a Chinese master. He had a beautiful quote. He says, off by an inch in the beginning, off by 10,000 miles at the end. And so if you're off by an inch, yes, we'll have problems 10,000 miles later, but you can also be aligned in the beginning, and that will have a profound ripple effect. So can we ask these difficult questions of technology? I think that's the stage we're in. Can we actually start to experiment? I mean, this is the title of your podcast, is Utopias, right? Like, can we actually have the audacity and the creativity to imagine that, okay, well, like even that, what we're talking about, market funded, instead of being market funded, what does it mean to be nature funded, right? You're like, oh, I did a small act of kindness. I could have just bought something for myself. Instead, I did it for somebody else. Michael Norton's research at Harvard, right? And your body immediately is rewarded by nature's endowment with all this oxytocin and serotonin and dopamine, right? So you're like, wow, this is nature funded. Like, I don't need to go and say, good job, you were kind. Like, you need to say, oh, good job, you accumulated $1 million. Way, yay, because that doesn't feel good on your system by nature's design. And so you're like, okay, so how do we start to align a lot of these tech designs, not in a way that manipulates our propensities that are subconscious, which is what social networks did, which is the Reid Hoffman quote. And everybody, everybody's at this point, it's like common knowledge that it does that. But with AI, can we actually not, go down that same track? Can we raise different questions? Can we experiment with bold possibilities of utopia? I mean, we're doing this in ServiceSpace, and so what if we fail? I'm good with that. Like, go ahead, dude. Go, like, okay, here was a guy who thought he was going to be nature funded, and guess what? He fell flat on his face. But I would say that is better than being, attempting to win with or to create a sort of faux story that is not nature supported, but that is sort of, I don't know, the master's tools, so to speak. using those and trying to feel in the short term that you've done something good. So I think we need a whole lot of people to step into that strength in themselves, to step into the mud of tech, because it's very muddy, it's yucky, it's a lot of monetization of things that are now going very below the radar of our consciousness. And to say, in this mud, can I birth a lotus? And maybe you can't, but I would say we have to keep
I love
trying.
you that you just said that. That's what the great Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh once used to say. There is no lotus without the mud. There is no mud without the lotus. They're both, they're both parts of the same being. Um, yes, and I think one of the big challenges, Nipun, is also from funding models to venture capital and investor models to obviously, you know, corporate governance in and of itself around tech. These are systems that make it difficult to actually propose or even just play with dramatic interventions. And I think this is one of the biggest challenges. Like, how do we, what are the levers to challenge that sort of system of governance that is built upon a game theory idea of like me versus you, which is not really true to the condition of being human or the condition of being alive.
Yeah, yeah, agreed. We were in India with Jay Cohen Gilbert. He's the founder of the B Corp movement, and he just gave us data after data of how you can feel like you're creating a fantastic business that's creating so much good in the world. But he says if you look at like the plumbing underneath the plumbing, it's kind of problematic when you are leading with these singular stakeholder ecosystems. And so how do we broaden that? So I think there's ways to respond to the challenges of the world, especially in tech, but I think doesn't necessarily just lead to at the level of me and the we and the us, right? Like, so I think there's something about working in the current paradigm and helping and hospicing it, so it goes to the new. I think there's something about creating these islands of sanity. So as Meg Wheatley says, these small little possibilities, small utopias elsewhere. And I think there's a whole range in between. Like, so let's go out and try to create new systems if that's your calling. Let's go out and try to do individual acts. Let's go out and do collective things. Let's raise new questions. Let's tilt the arc in a way that perhaps can shift collective potential.
And one thing that we can all note is that around the world, around the planet, and even in the United States, including in the United States, if you actually really get to know people and engage with people, they don't really necessarily subscribe fully or unconsciously to the zero sum idea. Like, I'm sort of at war with you. I'm in competition with you. I should just be all riled up by, hateful or inflammatory content that goes viral on social media. Almost everybody is concerned and at least anxious about this AI emergence that's using all our personal data. So actually, it's not, these technologies for me are not representational of being itself, even on this planet right now with all the suffering
Yeah.
on this planet.
Yeah. I mean, wasn't that their famous quote, the medium is the message, and if the medium is
Yes,
hijacked,
Marshall McLuhan.
yeah, Marshall McLuhan. And so if you look and you say, well, if the creators of the medium are saying, oh, yeah, we've kind of hijacked it, and if that's the context in which we are sharing our messages, those messages cannot be representative of our deepest truths. And I don't think they are. But I think we need people to step out of that because, especially the younger generation today, we're handing them such a inner ecosystem and so many warped platforms and mediums, that it becomes very difficult to discern signal from noise. Um,
That's right. A lot of precarity and a lot of anxiety, and like the first generation, like we talked about, to make less than its parents. So I guess that's where I want us to end this conversation. I mean, it's not even the first conversation we've had. This is one of many, many, many conversations, and I hope collaborations, like ways I can be of service to ServiceSpace, and all of us, all of our listeners. And I know it's not just about ServiceSpace, but about everything that these organizations represent. So I want to ask you sort of a two-part question. So, the first part is, as we were talking about with younger people, Gen Z, but just not just that, all of us, how do we maintain some sense, if you have thoughts of personal resilience and perseverance, given a lot of anxiety producing things that are all around us, from this forthcoming election to concerns around climate change to all these mass shootings to concerns around economic inequality and injustice to anxieties about new pandemics to the ways in which some other nations like China and Russia are treated as sort of like the enemy. There's a lot of stuff, right? It's a pretty heavy deal. So that's the first question. And then I want to end by asking you about your utopias. So, can you have any thoughts for us? Like, I know you've mentioned so much, but just guidance, thoughts.
As a young person growing up in a time like this, it can be very hard to process all these systems falling down, all these times of what they call the polycrises, right? That you try to fix one thing, and in the process you've just created two other problems, and it seems to be a net loss everywhere you look. Everything's sort of collapsing, and when you do that, it's darkest before the sunrise, right? Like, so to sort of remember that, but on what basis do you remember? Like, where on what basis do you find that trust that there is a sunrise amidst all of this? And I would say, it sounds so simple, but I would recommend a small act of kindness. And when you say, well, what is that going to do? Like, man, the climate is going down, inequality is skyrocketing, trust is collapsing to record lows, polarity is everywhere. You just have unending series of issues. A small act of kindness, it doesn't seem proportional. But it doesn't seem proportional from that level of consciousness, but from a deeper layer of consciousness that the kindness is inviting you into. It is changing the eyes through which you are going to see the world. It is changing the apparatus of what you think your body is. It's actually an antenna that is hooking you into each other, into the field of consciousness, every part of your body, every part of your existence. And all of that is embedded in that small invitation that seems completely outside of any NGOs. It seems completely outside of any impact mold. It seems completely outside of any power structures. And yet, and that's the thing, that's exactly why it's such a revolutionary thought, because everybody thinks it doesn't matter. It doesn't count. It will not create change. But by the very same reason that we go in, we do a small act, and all of a sudden, body is gushing with all these pro-social, elevating feelings inside of us. Like, it is because it's reconnecting us to a larger web. And I would say to all young people looking at all these crises, like, trust that we will plant a seed, trust on the basis of your own experience. Go out, do an act of kindness, see how that feels, and lean into that feeling, and then plant seeds without knowing, with the full hope that someday those seeds will turn into trees, those trees will turn into banyan groves, and that will give shade to people who will not be there, but you don't need to, who will not be there to thank you, who will not come back to thank you, but you don't even need that feedback, because the joy for you was the very act of planting the seed and stepping into that possibility of this deep, profound interconnection across time and space, which nature will give you right then and there. Like, that to me is a revolutionary
Amazing.
thought.
Amazing. It opens up a sphere of awareness, a sphere of being that's always there. It's always been there, but it's just like opening it. Okay. So final question for you. Boy, this has been really a joy. You mentioned Gandhiji and we've talked about the Dalai Lama. I'm curious about who are some of your, who are some heroes, who are some visionaries for our listeners and viewers to look to. And I know you're probably going to say everybody who engages in a small act of kindness. But I guess I want to ask you, about some folks that we can be inspired by today, or even as we look to the past or to the future. as well as your own vision of a utopia, of care and repair for the only planet we've ever known.
Yeah. Yeah, I tend to look at everyday heroes as my sort of beacons of inspiration. I went, my wife recently, just this last week, she said, "Oh, Nipun, one of the tire we have a signal, and the light on the dashboard says your tire is low air pressure." I was in an area tending to some family health matters, and I didn't know anybody in that area, so I kind of stop in and I look at this guy. And he's like a loop job guy. He doesn't do tire pressure. And I said, "Where can I go to do this?" And he's just like, "No, man, I got you, you know." And like he's like, and he does a very detailed job. He like looks and does all four. And then I'm like, okay, I should at least give this guy like some tip or something. And then I look, and I didn't have my wallet on me. I had forgotten my wallet back at home, and I'm like, oh my God, like what am I gonna do? And he saw me looking, and I didn't have my wallet. And he says, "Oh no, bro, this is not even for that, man. This is like, I don't even think about offering any money. I'm happy to just do this." And in that moment, I actually found a little heart pin made by women in the slums of India from waste cloth. I had it in my backpack, and I was like, as I left, I said, I really am sorry that I don't have my wallet on me, but I did find this heart pin. This is from me to you, man. And actually, it's not even from me. It's from somebody who gave it to me, and I'm passing it on. And thank you so very much. And so, in some sense, and it was like he then goes to his other mechanics and he's like, "Guys, guess what, man? I got a heart pin." And he's like, "I'm gonna take it home, show it to my wife." This giant guy. Um, and I like, to me, that gives me hope. That propensity for the human heart to unfailingly respond to the advances of love, of connection, of care. And I think they're everywhere. So I am certainly inspired by people like Gandhi, philosophers like J. Krishnamurti, seekers of all sorts across so many traditions that I have read and that continue to move me. But I find that rather than putting them on a pedestal, I find that the essence of who they are often flows. Now, it doesn't mean that car mechanic is in the same category as Raman Maharishi, as the great saint of India, is in, like, Raman Maharishi's center of gravity or Dalai Lama's center of gravity is going to be very different than the car mechanics. But in that moment, he was there, because he cared. And I wanted to honor that care, and I was there to receive with grace, and then to receive and pay it forward and say, man, to that guy, to Joe, his name was Joe. Um, and so I think, to me, those are the everyday heroes who are really my beacons, that sustain me, beyond the larger and larger than life sort of characters, like I said, like Gandhi, that really have shown a certain kind of have offered me a certain kind of inspiration. But this is like everyday inspiration, and that keeps me going. And utopias, man, I would just say my utopia would be that we all find that Joe moment, that we all see that, oh, like, this guy is dealing with some cancers in his family, and he's a little lost right now, and he doesn't know where to go for tire change. And okay. I mean, and none of this is said, but he kind of feels into it, and he's like, I got you, man. I got you, dude. We don't know each other in this form, me to me, but we know each other, we to we. My relatives and your relatives are all interconnected because we all we're all breathing the same air, and that's good, man. I got your air tires covered. And then he sees me fumbling and not finding it, and he's like, "Man, this is not about the master's tools, man. This is way beyond that, brother." And then I find it, in somehow I find the heart pin, which is not even from me. So to me, that encapsulates the whole thing, that this is the utopia, dude. Step into it, believe in it, know that the smallest act of kindness can make a big difference. That, as Gandhi once said, he says, in a gentle way, we can shake the world. And if our intervention if our gentle intervention feels like it's not working, I would say try a gentler intervention. And if that gentler intervention doesn't work, try an even gentler intervention. And which means not like disappear deeper and deeper into the abyss, which means that to have a gentle intervention, to know the audacity of a strength of the small, subtle act, is predicated on a deeper awareness of our interrelations. And that's the reason why a gentle act works. That's the reason why you would even have the audacity to dream, to believe that a gentle act will actually shake the entire fabric of our interconnection. But if you don't have that context of interconnection, you will never have that thought that in a gentle way you can shake the world. So I would say in my utopia, in a gentle way, you shake the world. And thank you, Ramesh, for standing for gently shaking the world, for that kind of a utopia.
Well, it's all of us. We must thank you. This is like so wonderful and nourishing and refreshing and inspiring. And so thank you, Nipunji.
Thank you.
The Utopias podcast with Professor Ramesh Srinivasan is produced and edited by me, Phoebe Browse. You can access episodes on all streaming platforms. And if you have questions or comments, please email podcastutopias@gmail.com. That's podcastutopias@gmail.com. See you all next time.